In the sweltering summer of 1590, an English governor named John White stepped onto the sandy shores of Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. He had been away for 3 agonizing years, delayed by a raging war across the Atlantic. He was returning to his family, his friends, and his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. He expected the ringing of blacksmith hammers and the laughter of children. Instead, he was met with a suffocating silence. 115 men, women, and children were simply gone. No struggle, no blood, no freshly dug graves. Only a single word carved deep into a wooden post. Croatoan. For more than 4 centuries, this remained America's most chilling, unsolved mystery. But the answer was never a vanishing. It was something far stranger. And for the first time, we finally have the proof. Picture the scene exactly as John White saw it. The fort stood as he had left it 3 years earlier. The wooden palisades were still upright. The gates hung unbroken on their hinges. And that was the first detail that made no sense. If the colony had been overrun, there should have been evidence everywhere. Burned timbers, shattered doors, arrows buried in the walls. There was nothing. White walked through the settlement in the August heat, calling out names, and the only answer was the wind moving through the trees. The houses were gone, but they had not been destroyed. They had been carefully taken down, piece by piece, the way you dismantle a home you intend to rebuild somewhere else. Heavy items the colonists could not carry, iron bars, lead, cannon shot, had been left behind, some of it buried in organized pits. Think about what this means for a moment. People fleeing for their lives do not stop to dismantle their own buildings. They do not pack their belongings and bury what they cannot carry. Whatever happened here had not happened in seconds. It had happened slowly, deliberately, according to a plan. And the strangest evidence was the evidence that was missing. There were no bodies. There were no graves. Search as he might, White found no scattered clothing, no abandoned tools, no sign that a single one of the 115 settlers had died on that island. For a colony supposedly wiped out, there was not one trace of violence. But there was one more detail, and it mattered more than all the others combined. Before White had sailed for England in 1587, he and the colonists had agreed on a signal. If they were ever forced to leave the island in danger or distress, they would carve a cross above their destination, a simple mark that would tell him everything. White searched the fort for that cross. It was not there. Instead, carved deep into one of the main entrance posts in clean, careful letters, was a single word: Croatoan. And here is where the story turns cruel. Because to John White, that word was not a riddle. He knew exactly what it meant. Croatoan was the name of an island to the south, what we now call Hatteras Island, and it was home to a native tribe that had been friendly to the English from the very beginning. One of that tribe, a man named Manteo, had even traveled to England and returned as an ally of the colony. The message was not a cry for help. It was a forwarding address. The colonists were telling him where to find them. White must have felt a surge of hope on that silent shore. His family was not dead. They were 50 miles away, waiting for him. He returned to his ship, determined to sail south the very next day. And then the sea itself intervened. That night, a violent storm swept in off the Atlantic. Anchor cables snapped. The ships were driven from their moorings and battered toward open water. His crew, low on supplies and unwilling to risk their lives any further, refused to attempt the short voyage to Croatoan. Instead, they turned east, back across the ocean. White stood on the deck and watched the coastline shrink behind him, knowing his family was somewhere on that shore, alive. He would never see America again. He spent his final years in England, unable to fund another voyage, and he died never knowing what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, or the colony he had governed. No rescue mission ever reached Croatoan. The one man who held the key to the mystery was the one man history never allowed to use it. And so the question hardened into legend, repeated for 400 years, It was asked around campfires in classrooms and in the quiet halls of universities. How does an entire colony, 115 men, women, and children, vanish from an island without leaving a single trace behind? The first answers people reached for were the darkest ones, and for centuries those ghost stories were all that anyone ever had. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does history. Where facts are missing, stories rush in to fill the silence, and for 400 years, the silence of Roanoke was filled with ghosts. The first and darkest theory was massacre. The colonists, the story went, had been slaughtered by hostile native tribes, their bodies dragged away, their fort left standing as a monument to the dead. It was the explanation that fit the fears of the age, but it did not fit the evidence. A massacre leaves marks. It leaves burned buildings, broken gates, arrowheads in the walls, and above all, it leaves bodies. Roanoke had none of these. The fort was intact. The buildings had been dismantled with care, not destroyed in rage. And no attacker in history has ever paused after a slaughter to neatly disassemble the homes of their victims and bury their iron in organized pits. The theory collapses under the weight of everything White did not find. The second suspect was Spain. This was the age of empire, and the Spanish crown was actively hunting rival European footholds along the Atlantic coast, determined to erase English claims to the New World. A Spanish raid seemed plausible. Spain had the ships, the soldiers, and the motive. But then the Spanish archives were opened, and the theory fell apart in the most unexpected way. Spanish records from the years after 1590 show their patrols were still searching for the English colony. They could not destroy what they could not find. The colony's greatest enemy was just as baffled by its disappearance as everyone else. Then came the quieter, sadder theories. Starvation, disease, madness. The colonists, cut off from resupply, had simply withered away on that sandy island. But this too runs into the same immovable wall. Starvation leaves graves. Disease leaves graves. 115 people do not die on a small island without a single burial, a single skeleton, a single trace. And desperate, dying people do not carefully pack their belongings before the end. Whatever happened to the colonists, they did not simply fade away where they stood. And of course, where evidence ends, folklore begins. Local legends spoke of curses, of the earth itself swallowing the settlers, of spirits in the coastal forests. These stories say a great deal about human imagination and nothing at all about what actually happened. But the strangest chapter in the mystery came centuries later, and it was not a legend. It was a lie. In 1937, a stone surfaced in North Carolina bearing a carved inscription, supposedly written by Eleanor Dare, John White's own daughter. It told of the colonists' fate, of death and hardship in the wilderness. The nation was electrified. Then more stones appeared, then dozens more, nearly 50 in total, conveniently discovered across multiple states, telling an ever more elaborate story. Scholars initially took them seriously, newspapers ran headlines, and then journalists began pulling at the threads. The stone's language contained words no Elizabethan woman would have used. The discoveries traced back to sources with everything to gain. The Dare stones were exposed as elaborate fakes, and the embarrassment was so severe that it poisoned the field for decades. Serious historians learned to keep their distance from Roanoke entirely, afraid of being tainted by association with hoaxes and campfire tales. The mystery did not just remain unsolved, it became untouchable. And that may be the greatest tragedy of all, because the real answer had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Here is the truth that 4 centuries of ghost stories managed to bury. History is rarely a story of vanishing acts. People do not dissolve into thin air. When a group of human beings disappears from one place, it is almost always because they have gone to another. The question no one was asking was the simplest one, not what destroyed the colonists, but where did they go? The first real clue would not come from a shovel or a stone or a legend. It would come from a piece of paper, a delicate, sun-faded watercolor map, sitting quietly in a museum drawer in London, holding a secret beneath its surface that no one had noticed for over 400 years. The British Museum in London holds millions of objects, and among them, filed away for centuries, was a watercolor map titled La Virginia Pars. It was painted in the 1580s by John White himself. Before he was a grieving governor, White was an artist, one of the finest of his age, and his delicate renderings of the Carolina coast had been studied by scholars for generations. The map showed the shoreline, the islands, the rivers winding inland. Researchers had examined every inch of it, or so they believed. In 2012, a researcher decided to look at the map differently, not at what was painted on its surface, but at what might be hidden beneath it. The technique was simple, but powerful. Specialized backlighting, the kind used to reveal underdrawings and corrections concealed inside old artworks. When the light passed through the 400-year-old paper, something appeared that no living person had ever seen. On the map, at the point where two rivers meet 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, there was a small patch of paper, glued down so neatly that it looked like nothing more than an old repair. Scholars had noticed it before and thought nothing of it. Artists patched their work all the time, but under the light, the patch gave up its secret. Hidden beneath it was the faint but unmistakable outline of a fort. A 4-point star, drawn in careful lines, the classic shape of a 16th century defensive fortification. Someone had drawn a fort at the junction of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers, deep in the Carolina mainland, and then someone had covered it up. Think about what this means for a moment. A map is a document of what exists, but this map showed something that did not yet exist, a planned fort at a specific location, hidden under a patch of paper for 4 centuries. And suddenly, a half-forgotten line from John White's own writings snapped into focus. Before he sailed for England in 1587, White recorded that the colonists had been preparing to move, in his words, 50 miles into the main. 50 miles into the mainland. For 400 years, that phrase had been treated as a vague intention, a passing remark with no destination attached. Now there was a destination, drawn by White's own hand, at exactly the distance he described, at the strategic meeting point of 2 rivers, where fresh water, fertile soil, and friendly trade routes came together. The map was not just a drawing, it was a blueprint for survival. But why hide it? Why would White conceal the very information that might one day save his colony? The answer lies in the world he lived in. This was the height of the war between England and Spain. Spanish agents intercepted English documents. Spanish patrols hunted the Atlantic coast for English settlements with orders to wipe them out. If this map had fallen into Spanish hands with a fort marked on it, it would have been a death warrant, an X marking exactly where to find and destroy the colony. The patch was not a repair, it was an act of concealment. White had hidden his colony's escape plan in plain sight, disguised as a flaw in his own artwork, protecting the location from the greatest naval power on Earth. The discovery electrified the archaeological world. For over a century, nearly every search for the lost colonists had focused on Roanoke Island itself and the coastal islands nearby. Teams had combed the same barren, storm-swept ground again and again, finding fragments and dead ends. Now, for the first time, there was a documented reason to look somewhere else entirely, away from the coast, deep into the mainland forests, to a quiet stretch of farmland in what is now Bertie County, North Carolina, where the 2 rivers meet. The site was given a deliberately anonymous name, Site X. But a drawing, no matter how remarkable, proves only intention. It proves that the colonists planned to go inland. It does not prove they ever arrived. To prove that, someone would have to find what they left behind in the dirt. And that is exactly what happened next. When you are searching for people who have been missing for 400 years, you do not look for their houses. Wood rots, palisades collapse, entire forts dissolve back into the soil within a generation or 2, leaving nothing but stains in the earth. So archaeologists follow a different rule, one that sounds almost absurd until you understand it. You do not look for what people built, you look for what they threw away. Garbage is immortal, broken pottery, discarded tools, the small shattered fragments of daily life, these survive in the ground for centuries, waiting. And in the quiet farmland of Bertie County, at the spot marked Site X, the The ground had been waiting a very long time. The excavations were led by the First Colony Foundation, a team of archaeologists and historians dedicated to solving the Roanoke question with evidence instead of legend. Guided by the hidden fort on White's map, they began to dig near the confluence of the two rivers, close to the remains of an abandoned Native American village, and the soil began to yield secrets. Piece by piece, the team unearthed fragments of English pottery, not fine porcelain, not decorative ware, but rough, practical, utilitarian ceramics, the kind used for cooking, storage, and daily survival. Among them was a very specific type, a greenish glazed ceramic known as Surrey Hampshire border ware, produced in England during the Elizabethan era. This was not pottery that traveled as trade goods. It was pottery that traveled with English households. Its presence in the Carolina interior meant English people had lived here, cooked here, eaten here, and broken their dishes here, 50 miles from the coast, exactly where the hidden map said they would be. But the most important discovery at Site X was not something the archaeologists found. It was something they did not find. In all the excavated soil, among all the English artifacts, there was not a single clay tobacco pipe. To understand why that absence matters, you have to jump forward 17 years. In 1607, the English returned to America and founded Jamestown, and the Jamestown settlers were famously, almost comically, devoted to smoking. Clay tobacco pipes were cheap, fragile, and everywhere. They snapped constantly and were thrown away by the thousands. Every English site from the Jamestown era onward is littered with their broken white stems, so reliably that archaeologists use them almost like a calendar. Find clay pipes, and you are standing in the 1600s. Find none, and you are standing somewhere earlier. Site X had English pottery and 0 pipes. The absence was a chronological fingerprint. Whoever lived here was English, and they were here before Jamestown. In this place, at that time, there is only one group of English people they could have been, the lost colonists of Roanoke. Still, the skeptics raised a fair objection, and it deserved an answer. Perhaps Site X was not the colony at all. Perhaps it was a temporary camp, a brief stopover from an earlier scouting expedition, a handful of men passing through rather than families settling down. One site, however suggestive, could be an anomaly. And then the anomaly argument collapsed. The First Colony Foundation confirmed the existence of a second location, designated Site Y, a separate and distinct Elizabethan site in the same Bertie County region, yielding its own evidence of early English presence. One site might be an accident. 2 sites, in the same inland region, both dating before Jamestown, form a pattern. This was not a campfire. It was a movement, a sustained English migration into the Carolina mainland, exactly as White's hidden fort had promised. The findings were published in a comprehensive volume, Excavating the Lost Colony Mystery, released with the University of North Carolina Press, complete with excavation data and photographs of artifacts the public had never seen. After 4 centuries, the inland theory was no longer speculation. It was validated historical reality, written in broken dishes and empty soil. But the mainland was only half the story. Because the colonists had left behind one more message, carved in wood on that silent island, and that message pointed in a completely different direction. For 400 years, the word Croatoan has been treated as one of history's great riddles, whispered like an incantation, printed on book covers, held up as the ultimate cryptic message. But here is the uncomfortable truth. It was never a riddle at all. Croatoan was simply a place. It was the 16th century name for the island we now call Hatteras, a long ribbon of sand and dune grass lying to the south of Roanoke. And it was not hostile territory. It was the home of the Croatoan tribe, the one group of native people who had remained consistently friendly to the English from the very first landing. Their bond had a name and a face. A Croatoan man named Manteo had sailed to England, lived among the English, learned their language, and returned as the colony's closest ally. When the desperate settlers carved that word into the post, they were not leaving a mystery. They were leaving directions. They were naming the one place on that entire coastline where they knew they would be welcomed. And for centuries, there were people who never stopped saying exactly that. Among the descendants of the region's native communities, including the Croatoan and the Lumbee, the oral traditions were remarkably consistent. The English settlers never vanished, the stories said. They came to live with us. They married into our families. They became us. Some traditions even pointed to English surnames and gray eyes appearing in native communities generations before any other English contact. For most of modern history, mainstream academia dismissed these accounts as romantic folklore, the kind of stories people tell to make the past feel closer. Oral history, the scholars said, was not evidence. They were wrong. Beginning in earnest during the 2024 and 2025 research seasons, archaeologists working on Hatteras Island uncovered something extraordinary. Digging into the island's soil, they found refuse pits, the buried garbage of daily life, and in those pits, English and Native American materials were not lying in separate layers, one culture replacing another. They were found sitting directly side by side. Native pottery mixed intimately with 16th century English tools, a rusted hilt from an English rapier, worked pieces of European copper, the remains of two completely different worlds discarded together in the same pits at the same time. In archaeology, this is as close to a smoking gun as evidence gets. Layers tell time and objects tell behavior. If the English had been conquered, their goods would appear as plunder, scattered and stripped. If they had merely traded from a distance, their goods would appear in small, precious quantities, curated and rare. Instead, English and native objects were thrown away together, casually, as ordinary household waste. Nobody throws away treasure. You only discard things that are part of everyday life. These pits were not the record of a battlefield or a trading post. They were the record of a shared kitchen. Two peoples, living under the same roofs, cooking at the same fires, raising their children in the same villages. The oral traditions had been right all along. It just took science 400 years to catch up. And with that, the true shape of the Roanoke story finally comes into focus. The colony did not vanish. The colony fractured. Picture their situation in the months after White sailed away. The food stores shrinking, disease moving through the settlement, relations with some mainland tribes turning hostile, and slowly, the most terrifying realization of all settling in, that the supply ships were not coming, that their governor was not coming, that England itself had forgotten them. Faced with that reality, 115 people made the only rational choice left. They split up. One group moved inland, up the rivers, to the fertile junction marked on White's hidden map, to the places we now call Site X and Site Y. Another group went south, to the Croatoan, to the one alliance they could trust with their lives. Two destinations, one desperate strategy. But shared pits and buried tools can only prove that two peoples lived side by side. To prove they became one people, science would need a different kind of archive. One written not in clay or copper, but in blood. Every archive humanity has ever built can be destroyed. Paper burns, stone erodes, wood rots into the soil. But there is one archive that survives everything, passed down through the centuries in an unbroken chain, copied and recopied inside every generation of every family. It is written in blood. Human DNA is a biological time machine. Locked inside your cells is a record of everyone you came from, stretching back not just decades, but millennia. And in the case of Roanoke, that record offered something no shovel ever could. If the colonists truly assimilated into the native communities, if they married, had children, and wove their bloodlines into the fabric of the New World, then their descendants are not lost at all. They are alive today, walking around with 400-year-old evidence inside their bodies. This is the premise of the Lost Colony DNA Project, an effort led by genetic genealogist Roberta Estes. The project's method rests on the way different pieces of DNA travel through time. The Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, following surnames down the male line like a signature. Mitochondrial DNA does the same through mothers, handed from a woman to every one of her children in a continuous maternal thread. An autosomal DNA, the shuffled inheritance from all of our ancestors, scatters fragments of the deep past across entire family trees. By reading these three records together, researchers can trace living people backward through the centuries, toward ancestors who left no gravestones and no written records. The project began collecting samples from families across the Carolina region, particularly those with old roots in the communities around Hatteras and the eastern seaboard, families whose oral traditions claim descent from the lost colonists. Then the genetic results were compared against known English lineages of the Elizabethan era. And among the participants, one case stands out above all the others. He is referred to publicly only as Mr. Brown. When his Y chromosome was tested, it was found to match a documented English lineage dating back to the Tudor period, the very era of the Roanoke voyages. But the discovery did not stop there. His genetic signature aligns with his own surname, and that surname appears on a very specific document. The original manifest of the 1587 colony, the handwritten list of the 115 settlers who sailed with John White, includes two men named Henry Brown and William Brown. A living American man carrying a Tudor-era English bloodline, bearing the same family name as two of the lost colonists themselves. It is a bridge across 400 years of silence, a genetic echo of a family that history declared vanished. Now, honesty demands a caveat, and it is an important one. DNA alone cannot close this case. A surname match and an Old English lineage are powerful, but on their own, they cannot prove that Mr. Brown descends from those two specific men rather than from some later English arrival. Genetics gives probabilities, not photographs. If the DNA evidence stood by itself, the skeptics would be right to hesitate. But it does not stand by itself. And this is the point where the entire investigation comes together. Consider what we now hold: a hidden fort, drawn by John White's own hand, marking a planned refuge 50 miles inland. Elizabethan pottery buried at that exact location, at not one site but two, sealed in time by the total absence of Jamestown-era pipes. Refuse pits on Hatteras Island where English and native belongings lie mingled together as ordinary household waste. Centuries of native oral tradition insisting the colonists joined their communities. And now, living descendants whose blood carries Tudor-era English signatures matched to names on the original colony manifest. These are 5 completely independent lines of evidence: a map, a dig, a second dig, a spoken tradition, and a genome. None of them depends on the others, and yet every single one points in the same direction. In any courtroom, this is what a verdict looks like. The 3 impossible clues from the beginning of our story, the hidden fort, the shared pits, the ancient bloodline, have all been paid in full. All that remains is to tell the story one final time, the way it actually happened. The solution does not diminish the story of Roanoke. It deepens it. We were taught that America began with Europeans arriving, conquering, and building rigid fortresses of Western civilization. Roanoke tells a different story. It is the story of ambition brought to its knees by nature, of colonists who survived only by ceasing to be colonists at all. When their food ran out, their leader disappeared, and their empire abandoned them. They let go of the world they knew. They dismantled their fort, walked into the forests and toward the shores, and wove their bloodlines into the fabric of the indigenous world. The 115 men, women, and children of Roanoke were never truly lost. We simply spent 400 years searching for an English colony, when we should have been searching for an American family. If you enjoy history illuminated by evidence, like and subscribe. See you in the next exploration.